Welcome back for another book review. Today we are talking about a classic. So this is The Spiral Dance by Starkhawk. This is the 10th edition. I know there's a 20th. I've heard rumors that there's like a 40th or maybe even a 50th at this point because this came out in 1979. So we're getting very close to the 50th anniversary of this book coming out. Honestly, most of the time when you look up like witchy books, this is one of those titles that's just a classic that everyone seems to mention to recommend. And honestly, as for like a teaching book, it's not like revolutionary. I think there's better books on the topic now. However, I do think at some point in your beginning witchcraft journey in that first year, there is something about learning the history of witchcraft, and not just like the ancient history of like the pagan years and like even before like civilization really, and like early times, which is usually sketchy on some of the historical things that you find in the witchy books. But like all of that aside, like our modern history with Wicca and witchcraft, this is one of those books that I think you should read through. Again, it's almost 50 years old, and that's not, like, it doesn't feel like the 70s was that long ago, but at the same time, I mean, that was the decade that a lot of women got rights here in the United States. Granted, a lot of them are now being taken away, but you know, that's the joys of living here. But like, there's just a lot that comes down to just like the history of this and like her issues that she was talking about in this edition specifically. It's interesting because she's talking about like the AIDS epidemic and how devastating it's been on the community, and it's so weird to look back because nowadays it's not as deadly of a disease. It's not great to catch, but like we have medicine to kind of prolong some of the effects of it. And it's not like a death sentence that it used to be. And it, like some of the political stuff, I was reading through it and it was like, oh my god, nothing's changed. And it's just one of those things where it's like, but look at the rising cost of living and like how the government hates us as the people. And you're like, oh my god, look at us. It's the same 50 years later. Basically. I mean, we're a couple years shy, but still, it'll be 2029 that this book turns 50, and that's not that far away, really. And so anyways, this book, again, I look at it more as a book of our modern history. As for the content of trying to learn about the craft, not the greatest. Honestly, again, I think there are better books. Historical text, it's great. Now, the reason for that is that I don't feel like a lot of the stuff is like greatly explained, and newer books, again, I feel like they just cover the information better. They did definitely pull from this book at some points, and of course the information just gets regurgitated by every single person who teaches about witchcraft. And so of course some of her teachings inevitably come up, but it's also kind of universal at this point. But it's just kind of interesting to read through. Like, she doesn't really explain like what the Wheel of the Year is. She just kind of jumps in with some rituals, and just like the S-spots, she just kind of explains how to do it. But the other interesting thing is that like she does, I don't know, she explains some stuff, but not others. She does have a lot of notes already. I've heard the 20th edition has even more. But she wrote this, I think she said she was like in her 20s, so like maybe close to my age, had wrote this, and some of the stuff she agreed with, some of it she didn't. And the way that she had described it for this edition was that it was probably a good thing she wrote it when she did, because it would have a very different tone now, in the 80s, than when she first wrote it. Most of this I didn't actually disagree with. It was just kind of like your basics. It is very Wiccan based. It is all about having a coven of 13. It's the goddess, and then you have the god, kind of. And some of the rituals, it was like, absolutely not. It does include a little bit of an initiation ritual, and it does have the Wiccan thing of like, you have to be blindfolded, and like, it sounded like they tried to leave a lot of details out, but I'm like, so are we like naked having a sword pressed against us? Because that's how it was in Buckland's book, and that's just not my thing. And so it's just little stuff like that, or like, at one point, all of the people in the circle, granted a lot of their rituals were skyclad, so you're naked, and then on top of that, everyone has to kiss everybody, and I'm like, no, no thank you, absolutely not. Like, that's a no for me. And like, there was just like little stuff like that that it was just like, oh, I wouldn't like your particular tradition personally. And she does really emphasize that like group work is better than solitary, but she does have a couple little like, well, if you can't, and like some people I guess choose to be solitary, and I'm like, yeah, because honestly groups will inevitably always have drama, and being solitary you have so much more freedom over what you choose to do versus in a group. But overall, I mean, the information really wasn't that bad. It was just her tradition. She's just explaining her beliefs, and it doesn't come across really preachy, which was nice. It is really just like presenting the information. And so like it wasn't like revolutionary by any means, but maybe at the time it was. That's why, again, I think of this more as a book to look at for the historical like value of it. Because really, this book is one that so many people will mention and talk about. The exercises in here, again, I feel like newer books have better options for you to go through, but at the time, 50 years ago, this was probably like you needed to have this kind of information. But nowadays you can find that same information and better on like YouTube, TikTok probably. I haven't had the greatest of luck on like Witch Talk, but I've heard that sometimes you have good luck. But definitely here on YouTube, and like there's certain like Facebook groups, and of course modern books and courses. Just, I feel like their exercises and their layout tend to be a little better, but this was probably really amazing to have back in the day. Now, it doesn't necessarily walk you through a year and a day, it just kind of tells you how to do some of the stuff. And so for that aspect, again, I don't think it would be like super helpful if you're trying to learn how to do the craft, but learning how it was treated back in almost 50 years ago, it is interesting. Because you gotta remember, for this generation of witches from the 70s and 80s, Gardner was kind of old at that point. He was, like I think his book was published in like the 40s or 50s, and I think he was initiated in the 30s. So even by that, you know, like that's still a huge jump of time, and now we've got that again. And so it's just another little spot that we need to look back and acknowledge our own modern witchcraft history. So anyways, that's pretty much it for this book. It's one that I don't know that I would really need a copy on my shelves, but I do have it. But I bought it used. It was $6, so it wasn't that bad, but I don't know what it would be nowadays. I bought this in 2015, and initially I had read through this, and I was in college, and I was learning how to annotate books, and honestly I don't like doing that now, but some of the things that I would argue against was just like, oh honey, like, oh, like I was really like miffed on how she was describing like the deities basically, because it's like, because the goddess is a manifestation in human beings, we do not try to escape our humanness, but seek to become fully human. And then I'm like, why worship something that is flawed? And I'm like, I still kind of agree with that point, because like, okay, learning with the Norse gods now, that particular pantheon is really, to me, seems to be all about learning how flawed the gods and humans are, and how you make mistakes and they have consequences, and that they're not perfect and we're not perfect. But when books like this present the goddess as this all-perfect being and they were created in their image, and I'm like, have you seen like when your body doesn't work properly? Because like, no. And I think it does give a little bit of like, I don't know, it's not talked about a lot, and you can tell the authors that do struggle with some form of like a physical ailment, and then you see these kinds of books and you're like, you haven't experienced that yet, have you? Because those of us who haven't been blessed with a perfectly healthy functioning body, you know that it's like, what are you talking about? We're flawed? Like, that's it. Our body isn't like a perfectly functioning thing. And even then, like, the regular human body just is kind of a hot mess anyways. But like, specifically those of us who deal with ailments, when I had read through this in 2015, apparently that was a big deal of like arguing against. And then of course we have other things like, it's easier to be celibate than to be fully alive sexually. At the time, I don't know that I had really like owned the title of ace where I do now. and like where I fit into that spectrum. But like, I advocate all of the time for this one. Sexuality does not have to be the forefront. It can if you want to be, but it doesn't have to be. And it's just like there's little snide remarks like that of like just kind of pushing that like you have to be like sex positive, and like I get that they're trying to push back from the opposite side of things, but it's kind of like that pendulum swung a little too far the other way, and it does alienate people, whether you're on the ace spectrum, the demisexual spectrum, or even if you've gone through like trauma and abuse and things like that. Like, you might not be as like sex positive. And of course she does focus really heavily on the like female body being through the traditional stages of life, where it's like, oh my god, but look at how magical, you now have your period, and oh my god, look, you get to have a womb and you get to have children, and then you get to go through menopause. And it's like, there's other things besides just your reproductive organs, but that's cool. She does mention a little bit for the men's mysteries and a little bit for the men, but she also, in her later notes, kind of goes against it and like needed to explore it a little more. And so it's interesting, my notes that I had in 2015 compared to now that I've been married and been with a guy for almost 6 years. And so it's like very different because my husband is a witch. So like it's fun to compare a male witch and the like things that he comes across and like his experiences and like his experience with other male witches compared to like female authors that honestly, we focus so heavily on the female body and like the female phases of life, and we don't really do that much for the men. And so like I had argued against it in like many different ways in 2015 that like nowadays I don't know that I would, but it was something to kind of point out. Personally, I don't like the idea that the goddess created everything and that the god like is her lover's son thing. Like that's just never sat well with me. And honestly, most of like the Norse myths don't really have that as much as like some of the others where you have like the sister wife, literally. Like just, you know, I don't know. Whatever mythology you want to work with is cool. But anyways, basically this is just a historical text for me. And that's all I'm really viewing it as. I would never like try and go through the exercises in this. This is just something to read to know our history as witches. So anyways, that is going to be it for this book. I would love to hear your thoughts on this one in the comments down below. Huge thank you to my patrons. I'll have their names here on the screen. If you'd like to support me and get access to exclusive content, it is patreon.com/nightwillowcrafts. Make sure to like and subscribe. I post every single day. And until next time, thank you so much for watching, and blessed be.